of the SCAG organization, as well as he has been a leader in the American Society for Public Administration. And currently, USC, University of Southern California, that I also represent, is very fortunate to have his leadership as a senior fellow there at the Keston Institute for Transportation. And so it is my honor to present the senior fellow for the University of Southern California, Mark Pisano, to give us an overview of rail transportation in our state. Thank you, Mr. Pisano.
Thank you very much, Chairman Davis and other members of the committee. My name is Mark Pisano. I am a senior fellow at the School of Policy Planning and Development at USC and chairman of the Keston Institute for Infrastructure and Public Finance. I'm chairman of the advisory board of that particular institute. I also co-chair a national effort called America 2050, which is aimed at developing the 21st century investment plan for America to keep us competitive, to deal with issues of global warming, and also to deal with issues such as energy and other infrastructure categories. And I just wanted to I will mention the work of that body as well in my testimony. I have prepared written testimony that is submitted to you. I'm not going to read that testimony, but rather I would prefer to address the high points and hopefully from that discussion, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Sure.
And I also want to thank you, Assemblyman Davis, for being such a good representative to the area in which the university that I'm now located resides. And there is rail transit being built along the corridor of that university as we talk. And that's an important part of the rail transportation. And today I will really cover the issue of rail transit in all of its modes. At the last hearing of the Select Committee, which was in April of last year, Rich Little, who is the director of our institute, testified to the fact that the perfect storm is occurring in California as we move forward to the future. We have growth, we have congestion in all modes, and we also have global warming targets to meet. And since that time, the perfect storm has been hit by a financial meltdown tsunami, and it makes the perfect storm even more difficult to navigate. And it's in that context that I would like to address my comments today. The downturn in revenues is affecting all levels of government. I'm not going to talk about the impact at the state level. You have lived it, and you understand it firsthand. But that impact in revenues is also affecting local government and local agencies. And members of our advisory committee are from the financial community, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and others, are really noting that there's a lag between downturn in business activity and revenues that local entities, that state and local entities receive. And this is it's more pronounced at the local level given their revenue sources. And they're anticipating that the revenue forecasts and the revenue availability for local governments and local special districts will actually be more serious next year than the year that we currently are in, and that is likely to continue for some time in the future. So the specific agencies, I'm sure you'll hear from them today as to what revenues are doing to their current operations, to their current construction programs for rail. It's extending time periods, and it's making priority setting all the more difficult within those local agencies. The other part of what you asked me to address was what would the impact of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act be for the state. Clearly, there are revenues that have come to local governments. There's $26+ billion that has come to highway-ready, shovel-ready projects. And then, most importantly, there's for the hearing today, there's $8 billion in the high-speed rail. I would like to note that by way of development of that program, there have been a lot of input into the development of it. America 2050 2 years ago, or 18 months ago, put forth a major report to the transition team. The chair of that committee, Mort Downey, participated with America 50. We were really pleased to see that the President's leadership, the Assemblywoman, you spoke to it, but the President has picked up on that idea and has made it the hallmark. And it's a game changer. It could be a game changer for the country, and it could be a game changer for our regions. Subsequent to that report, the America 2050 has recently put out a report on where high-speed rail works best. And I want to speak to a couple points in that report. It may help you in your deliberations and in your legislative activity. We did a pair analysis of 100 corridors in the United States where high-speed rail could work. California has 4 of the top 10 corridors. There's no question that we, because of congestion, because of economic development patterns, and also very important, and I'm going to emphasize this in my hearing, local transit and rail networks. We are developing them. The only area that outperforms us actually is the Northeast Corridor. The criteria that we used and the resultant scoring, I want to just highlight a couple of factors. The first criterion that really helped us was this local transit network. And our high-speed rail system, particularly if it's tied into the local transit, rail and transit, if it's tied in carefully in a cooperative way, it'll accelerate the development of ridership on that particular system. So I urge your attention to that issue. The second is within the America 20 framework, we identified the 11 areas in their large economic regions where 85% of all of the population, employment, and economic growth in this country will occur. California has 2 of those mega regions, one in the Bay Area that goes from a large portion of the Central Valley to the Bay Area, and then the second in Southern California that basically goes from the northern part of Baja up to Bakersfield and out as far as the Inland Empire and our neighboring states. Tying the high-speed rail system into the economic activity of those regions and tying it into the transit system will produce the kinds of ridership and the economic development that will justify that more than justifies the expenditure. But if we're not careful on how the system ties into the planning and to the transit networks and to the economic strategies, we may miss that opportunity. Let me note one other federal policy that will impact on the way we look at this issue over the next several years. Given the national debate on health care and the Senate's insistence that we not undertake federal legislation that increases the debt, in recent meetings that America 2050 has had in Washington, we have learned from a number of congressional and Senate leaders that transportation will need to live under the same policy framework. In fact, all federal programs are going to be living under that framework. The question for the state, the question for our local communities is, what do we do in light of this fiscal issue that we're now confronted, both at the local, state, and I'm going to start, and I would suggest at the federal level. The major, and furthermore, we cannot delay developing the infrastructure that is going to be needed to respond to this perfect storm, and transportation, rail transportation in particular, will be key. How then do we proceed? I'm going to suggest that, and this is what we heard in Washington, and we're hearing, we're doing research on this at USC, the concept of beneficiary pay needs to become the core of our financial framework in the area of transportation. Now, what does that mean? It means those who use and those who benefit from the investments participate in the financial structure of the program. and the financial underpinning of the program. Now, how does that relate to the issue at hand? First of all, the notion of beneficiary pay that we applied to the interstate was the entire country paid for the system because the entire country perceived that they were going to benefit. The investments that we're now making, the entire country doesn't necessarily see that they benefit, and therefore, across the board, our revenue sources may not be as fruitful a financial source in the future. If we apply the concept of beneficiary pay to corridors, which is what we're talking about in rail, there can be additional sources that come to the table. Let me be very specific. We know that tolls and fares are part of the finance structure. We also know that there's difficulties in raising additional toll and fare revenues. But there are other beneficiaries besides just the use. A rail project or a corridor development is made, and there are beneficial uses to the land and to the economic development system around them. The work that my organization, that SCAG did in developing our growth vision and our growth pattern, we did a return on investment calculation of the change in development patterns and the economic return that would go to the surrounding land areas. From that work, we called it a tipping point analysis. From that work, we were convinced that there are revenues that in fact can be captured, that can be made part of the financial stream. And then there are more immediate direct users of the system that can be tied into the system. Critics say it can't be done. It cannot be done if it's after the fact. If it's before the fact, as you're developing the system and you redevelop the development pattern, if the financial system is thought of at that period in the process, namely now that we're doing the planning for the high-speed rail, now that we're doing the planning for new rail corridors, and there will be resultant changes in land use patterns. If at that point these tie-ins between the beneficiary users and the rail finance program is made, then there are significant revenues that can complement the other revenue streams so that we can get the projects done. And let me just conclude. The state is going through a real change in its development patterns because of the needs for different needs and pricing of housing, and we're we're changing the development pattern in the state. Now is the time also to change the financial structures so that the changing development patterns, the changing revenue streams can participate in the projects. A combined pool of revenues from state and federal resources, from users, and from beneficiaries surrounding projects can develop the revenue stream that we need over the next several years to keep us on track in developing the program. If we don't undertake such a strategic change in financing, we will be our projects will continually be stalled because we don't have the money at any level of government to keep them on track, and that would make the perfect storm that we're in all the more difficult. In some, I think you can, and let me just refer back to the movie The Perfect Storm. Doing what you do in the past is the worst thing you can do when you hit the kind of turbulent policies that we're now hitting. Changing the way we go about thinking about these systems, financing these systems, and changing the way the state develops and operates is one way to, in fact, it's the only way that I could think of right now to avoid that storm. Thank you, and I'd be happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pisano. I first would like to ask you about the practice that we've had to meet our budget shortfall. We've often borrowed from transportation funding. What impact, if any, has that had as we progress towards our infrastructure in the state?
Well, I can tell you in the past what it did when I was preparing regional plans and programming capital investments. Basically what it did, it extended the life period of a project anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And during that period, the inflationary increase that we experienced in many instances almost doubled the cost of those projects. So what did we do? We extended the time period of the project, and secondly, we didn't add the additional projects and financing that we need. Borrowing from infrastructure, which is the basis of supporting future economic growth, is the wrong place to borrow from it. On the other hand, I understand when you're faced with budget realities, you deal with the choices in front of you. My encouragement to you, again, is think strategically so you don't have to go into that box. Develop revenue streams that aren't tied that aren't related to budgetary options, and develop a financing structure that allows capital projects to move in a scheduled way. That's the single biggest that's the biggest time saving and money saving that the state could establish as a policy framework. Delaying these projects just adds to their cost, and the costs are going to be substantial.
Thank you. Before I introduce our next Assemblywoman, Assemblywoman Kathleen Galgiani, who was responsible for authoring our high-speed rail legislation, has joined us, and thank you. And and along with Assemblymember Ma, and I think I was a co-author on it as well. Assemblywoman Ma has a question for the panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Pisano. And you mentioned the perfect storm, and I used to talk about the perfect storm in terms of the bond, how gas prices went up to $5 a gallon, and we have the global warming initiative, and the airlines were having problems, the auto industry was having problems, and I think people kind of understood that we needed to pass the high-speed rail bond. So I'm glad that the voters did, and I agree with you that we should not delay. We delayed putting the ballot on the initiative twice prior, and originally the 9.95 was a lot of money 6 years ago, and 9.95 in November was only a third of what was needed to build the system because we kept delaying and all the costs keep increasing. So that is a concern. We do have a timeline for our projects, and the longer they go, the more delays, the more it costs the taxpayers' money. We also have to be creative about funding. I had a bill that reached the governor's desk twice now, and he vetoed it. It was to create a tax increment financing district around the transit hubs. And again, that's a way of being creative and trying to generate revenues and trying to improve the economic development around these transit hubs, especially given high-speed rail is now going to go across the state, and there's going to be new transit stations. So I'm going to be working on that again. I hope that I will get it to the governor's desk next year, but there is never enough money for infrastructure and transit. So we do have to be more creative, and I thank you for bringing that up.
One thought for your consideration as that bill is developed, and that is the time period as to when, and the TIF structure is one. There's a lot of different ways that you can structure financing arrangements, and furthermore, I think there's a lot of existing legislation that is not being used in this arena, and the reason it's not being used is that at the local level, if you apply it at the end, after you've done the planning and you've done the zoning, and you're now moving forward to work on the capital investment, what you basically find is that the local political leadership gets besieged in hearings and implementation of the program, and therefore it's not generally used, even though we have authority that I could point to today. Assemblyman Aguirre in the 90s had 2 or 3 bills that were aimed at precisely this kind of opportunity. We need to move that financing up front when we do the initial planning. And there's another bill that is now being implemented, SB 375, where regions look at their development patterns, cities look at their zoning, and then you look at transportation for air quality and CO2 reductions. Well, there's another opportunity in that phase of the process. That's where the financing plan needs to be considered. Before you get started and before you put down a line, and once the line is down, the property owners around that area basically they enjoy the benefits of all the increased value of that development. So as you develop your legislative strategies, look carefully at what phase of the decision-making does financing get introduced. And too often, and I'm speaking now from decades of experience in the planning arena, we get our plan all done and then we look to how do we finance it. We change the zoning and we don't think about the financing. That has to happen simultaneously. And if we have to transition, we're going to have to transform the way we grow and develop the state and the way we finance our infrastructure and I'm really encourage you to pursue developing additional TIF structures.
Assemblywoman Galgiani.
You mentioned that there's legislation that we should be taking advantage of that we're not. Can you be more specific? You know, for us that have come in just in the last few years, there are pieces of legislation that I'm sure could benefit us, but if we don't know what they are because we weren't here, it's more
well, the Public Finance and Infrastructure Financing Act, and I don't have the bill number on the top of my head, but Assemblyman Aguirre was the author. There's two such bills. One allows you to create assessment, and the other allows you to do user charges on a whole different set of infrastructure. It has not been used by local government. Maybe once, I think there were one or two attempts in the city and county of San Diego, but it has not been widely used. And we need to examine why hasn't it been used. What are the difficulties in those bills? And I'm going to suggest, as I did in my testimony, we need to work, and this is where universities and partnerships at the local and and also at the state level could be of help. And that is, how do we go forward with our redesign? And I'm just going to use one metaphor. Our growth vision in Southern California came to the conclusion you change 2% of the land area, you tie the right transit and particularly rail transit investments to it, and the state performs totally different. And that 2% was just as important in Riverside and San Bernardino and Imperial as it was in LA and Orange. Well, at the time, the zoning and the planning, and that's a very difficult, that's not easy to do. At the time we start the planning and development, that's when we should start thinking about what are the financing structures that are going to be used for the infrastructure. In many respects, it's not different than Melrose financing, but thought of at the general plan level, not just the new property level. And how do we deal with this chicken and egg problem? And how do we deal with getting this done in a way where and this is the other reason why these financing tools aren't used, that they're viewed as piling costs on to people that are having a very difficult time in the development field already. So where does the increased wealth go? It goes to the property owner. Now, the property owner should get some benefit, but not all the benefits that are accrued to him. So part of that wealth needs to go into and this is what you do in a Melrose Act, part of the increased wealth on that piece of property goes into the infrastructure to support it. Let's extend that concept, that thinking, into the way we design and the rail program, where you have these enormous benefits surrounding not just stations, but the surrounding area. I think it's not the only source of funding, and it can't be viewed that way, but it can be viewed as a significant complement.
Thank you.
Just one additional question. You talked about the Melrose Act and these community facility districts. So are they being created right now around the state?
For new development, they have been used pretty extensively.
They have been? Okay.
Well, and it's been the primary tool that we've used to develop undeveloped land. And by the way, the issue that most often gets put on the table, and that is, how do you get the votes needed? Do you need a 2/3 vote, or can you have a simple majority? the way you structure the program, you can get a simple majority of landowners, not just 2/3 of voters, if you structure your district correctly. So learning how to do this and getting some good test cases and some good pilot cases is probably I would say one of the area that we need to explore the most, given the fiscal, the realities that we have in general fiscal revenues coming to these investments. They're not being used as, we're not moving forward on them as fast and as much as in fact, we aren't using them right now. But in very isolated cases, immediately around joint development agreements around stations. That needs to really be extended. And you would be, I mean, I was amazed when we took in our growth vision for our 2% areas, what would be the return on investment to projects into land at this particular time? You change the zoning, you change the development pattern, and you go through this return on investment. We use same pro formas at a community level as the builders do for projects. There is a large amount of wealth and finance involved in that redefinition of what California is going to look like. I mean, I think you would be surprised at the revenues that could be generated if we're creative.
Thank you very much. I look forward to working with you. I love your card. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very
Fasano.
much.
Thank you so much, and we are better off by having the involvement of the Keston Institute from University of Southern California, and they will be working with our Rail Transportation Committee as we are involved throughout different regions of this state. So again, Mr. Fasano, thank you so very much. And a part of what was mentioned was the impact of the economic downturn. We'd like to briefly review the factors involved in the economic downturn and its impact on rail transportation. And with that, I want to ask Gus Corey, legislative advocate for California Transit Association. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. Thank you, Gus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. That was perfect pronunciation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I lucked up there.
Great. Thanks. Gus Corey here on behalf of the California Transit Association. We represent approximately 80 transit operators throughout the state, including 100 suppliers and vendors as well. Our association includes commuter agencies such as ACE in the San Joaquin Valley, BART, Metrolink, Caltrain, the Coaster in San Diego, Caltrain being in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Capital Corridor, of course, which is the main rail line that goes from Sacramento into the Bay Area. Just a very quick overview of our transportation needs. I think Assemblymember Ma alluded to this. The California Transportation Commission estimates that the state's infrastructure needs hover at or exceed by now $200 billion. Proposition 1B was a great down payment. That was about $20 billion back in 2006, but as you can imagine, we have a long way to go in order to really address the state's infrastructure needs. And part of the reason is because the state's population continues to grow. The Public Policy Institute estimates that the state's population by the year 2025 will exceed 50 million people. And so it's difficult in order to maintain the current infrastructure. The SHOP program, which is basically the main program that rehabs the current state system, is underfunded by about $3 billion annually. And so it's difficult to justify additional capacity, although with the population boom, folks are moving further out into rural areas and they're commuting into work because housing is more affordable and the like. So an investment in public transportation is critical in sustaining the integrity of the state highway system, improving traffic congestion, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, as Mr. Pisano alluded to, and reducing our dependence on foreign oil. So what are the benefits of rail transportation in the state? Well, the average person spends about 62 hours in traffic congestion per year. So it's the equivalent of session in July. But public transportation reduces gas consumption by approximately $1.4 billion annually. That's about $15 million per day. A full rail car removes 200 cars off of the road. I'm emphasizing my presentation on rail, obviously, but if you were curious, a bus takes about 20 cars off the road. A van pool takes about 12 cars off the road. Transit carries 18% of the trips into San Diego, 30% of the trips into Los Angeles, and 38% of the trips into San Francisco and Oakland. Every dollar invested into public transportation yields $6 in economic activity. That's one of the reasons why the association supported Assemblymember Ma's AB 338. Approximately, and depending on, the numbers hover quite a bit. You hear for every $1 billion invested, it's about 27,000 jobs. We have data that shows 47. Let's just be conservative and say 30. About $3.4 billion has been diverted away from public transportation since 2007-8. So $3 billion times 30,000. I mean, we're talking, or for every $1 billion, we're talking 30,000 jobs. That's approximately 90,000 jobs. I'm sorry, that would be created. Impact on the environment: 33% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. Public transportation produces 95% less carbon monoxide and 90% less in volatile organic compounds than a private vehicle. And the association is emphatic that if SB 375 is really going to work, you have to invest in public transportation. It's the best tool in the toolbox that we can use to make that become a reality. So, do people use rail? The answer is yes, absolutely. Rail is also not a partisan issue. You have people in the Central Valley that have to commute into the Bay Area, so they hop on ACE. You have people in Southern California that may live in the Inland Empire, San Bernardino. They have to take Metrolink to get to work because congestion is so bad. Los Angeles has the worst air quality in the nation. The Central Valley is second. So we have to invest more in rail. Capital Corridor, and I don't want to steal too much of their thunder because they're going to be in the following presentation, but they had 1.7 million trips in 2008. Caltrain averages 44,000 riders per weekday. Metrolink averages 45,000 riders. The Sprinter in San Diego, 800,000 riders per month. So how has the economy impacted rail operations? Well, as I mentioned, pursuant to recent budget actions, approximately $3.4 billion has been diverted away from public transportation without any repayment. That's about 73% of all funding that's available that has gone for other general fund purposes. In addition, the State Transit Assistance Program, which is responsible for providing operations funding. So it's great to have the capital investments, to have the rail cars, to have the buses, but you need the funding in order to hire the train operators and the bus drivers so that those capital investments don't just sit in the yard. So from the federal government, we've received from ARA $170 million. So while it's appreciated, it's really a drop in the bucket considering what we've lost. Proposition 1B, as I mentioned earlier, was a $20 billion investment. $5 billion of that was earmarked for public transportation. $1 billion was for transit security, but for actual transit capital, it was $4 billion. $400 was for intercity rail. $3.6 million was for transit operators in the state to invest in capital investments, rolling stock purchases such as buses, and to lay more rail lines. Out of the $3.6 billion, the legislature has appropriated about $1.3 billion of the funds, $600 million in 07-08, $350 in 08-09, and for 09-10, another $350. However, due to the Pooled Money Investment Board's actions and obviously the economy being in the dumps, we've only received approximately $875 million of those revenues. So we received all of our 07-08 allotment, half of the 08-09 money. Cycle 2, we're hoping at some point later on in this year we'll receive it, and then 09-10, obviously that amount was just approved. So investing in public transportation, as I mentioned, rail especially, reduces the pressure on the STIP, having to fund additional capacity. I'm not saying that we don't need additional capacity. We obviously do. But it makes it more difficult when you don't have revenue and you have to take money away from the highway side in order to fund rail programs that are being underfunded. Mm-hmm. So I handed out, I think the sergeant passed it out, a packet for your information, and I won't go through all of the details, but I just wanted the committee to be aware that we did a survey of our membership because we want to make this stuff tangible. We throw a lot of numbers around. You know, you guys took $3 billion, but what's it really mean? How's it impacting your constituencies? How's it impacting the way that we conduct our business? And so there's information in there that talks about job loss in the Bay Area alone due to the cuts that have occurred. In the Bay Area alone, we're expecting 2,000 employees to be laid off. That's bus and train operators. You know, there's a lot of information in here about fare increases that a lot of entities have had to approve, boards have had to approve, and our ridership is very diverse. They're not mobilized. You've got seniors, you've got disabled folks, you've got students, and so a lot of those folks are people that don't have the means to have their own personal vehicle, or it's just that much more convenient for them to be able to traverse to and from work. So I encourage you to look through that information as well. So what are the solutions that in investing in rail? Well, the obvious thing to our association, notwithstanding the current budget situation, is to reinstate funding to the public transportation account. And the state transit assistance program in particular, we desperately need operations money in order to take advantage of the funding that's being made available through Proposition 1B, through the ARA program. Another opportunity may be to double the Transportation Development Act funds. It's basically the quarter cent that each county has to fund local transportation operations and capital. And third is to expedite Proposition 1B funding. We currently have money. The voters have approved it. The funding that I spoke of, if it's possible to coordinate with the Pooled Money Investment Board and to help expedite the release of those funds so that we can create jobs, high-paying jobs that can help stimulate the economy and get us out of the slump that we're currently in. So with that, I will close, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. I think those are some reasonable recommendations. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, well, we thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. You got to go. We're going to talk about high-speed rail. I know you might want to stay just 1 minute. We have Dan Levitt, who is from the California High-Speed Rail Authority, and he's going to give us an update and the impact of Obama's vision to build high-speed rail corridors along the 10 of the country's busiest routes. And, of course, this is probably the passion of most people in rail transportation today, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to give you an update on where we are towards actually implementing high-speed rail in California, but also for giving you an update on the federal program that is essential, not just in California, but for implementing high-speed rail around this country. What I'd like to do is first play a short video that's our latest that kind of gives an overview on the California program. So if we could start with that, that would be great.
In 2000, Californians made more than 500 million trips between the state's different regions. By 2030, that number will double to nearly 1 billion, with demands on our roads, our airports, ever increasing as our population and economy grow.
With the passage of Proposition 1A in November 2008, California established itself as the leader for building America's first world-class, environmentally friendly transportation alternative for the 21st century. A truly high-speed system, rivaling the best-known systems already operating in 11 countries around the world. Traveling at speeds up to 220 miles per hour over an 800-mile route, It will whisk riders from downtown Los Angeles to downtown San Francisco in just over 2.5 hours.
California's high-speed train system will be the largest public works project undertaken in the state in 50 years. Building this state-of-the-art network will create more than 600,000 construction jobs and another 450,000 permanent jobs.
Clean, electrically powered high-speed trains will also provide crucial environmental benefits. By using just 1/3 the energy per passenger of airplanes and 1/5 the energy per passenger of automobiles, high-speed trains will help California meet long-term goals for reducing greenhouse gases, eliminating as much as 12 billion pounds per year, and reducing our dependence on foreign oil by 12.7 million barrels annually.
With trains carrying up to 1,000 passengers departing as frequently as every 5 minutes during peak hours, high-speed trains will carry as many as 100 million passengers per year by 2030, about 10% of the state's interregional traffic. Train stations will be developed to connect with local and regional transit systems and airports. Locating stations within existing transportation corridors will continue to promote transit-oriented development within urban centers, helping ease urban sprawl and loss of open space.
The first step in building California's high-speed train is design and environmental review. State and federal law requires a full environmental analysis to assure that all known environmental impacts of a project are identified and mitigated, with alternatives fully considered. In 2005, the California High-Speed Rail Authority completed the first level of environmental review for the full statewide system. Planning and environmental review is now underway at the project level.
8 project sections have been established for the 800-mile system. San Francisco to San Jose, San Jose to Merced, Merced to Sacramento, Merced to Bakersfield, Bakersfield to Palmdale, Palmdale to Los Angeles, Los Angeles to Anaheim, Los Angeles to San Diego via the Inland Empire. The authority is also pursuing a joint use project in the Altamont corridor.
Each section will undergo a separate detailed environmental review. Stakeholders, from residents who live along the proposed high-speed line to local governments and non-governmental organizations, are part of the planning process. Community meetings are held to provide citizens with details about the project in each section and to listen, answer questions,
this kind of depth of profile,
and seek input.
Is that something that you're considering?
Next, a draft environmental impact report and statement will be issued identifying preferred routes through each section. A second round of public input and review will occur before a final analysis is completed and route selection is made.
While construction of local projects necessary to support the system could begin as early as 2010, construction of key components of the high-speed train are expected to begin in earnest by 2012. High-speed train systems are among the most sophisticated engineering projects in the world. To build the high-speed train route, California will draw on the expertise and experience of those who have already built other high-speed train systems. Building the bridges, tunnels, and track required for high-speed train travel will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Early benefits will be evident as existing conventional train corridors are upgraded with electrification, improved track, separated grades that eliminate crossings, and fail-safe automatic stop safety control systems.
As construction continues, California's first high-speed train will begin running on a designated test section. Engineers will fine-tune the many complex systems that make high-speed train travel the safest in the world. By 2020, passenger service will begin on the Anaheim-Los Angeles to San Francisco backbone of the system, a route of roughly 500 miles. The Merced to Sacramento and Los Angeles to San Diego sections will then come into service several years later, completing the entire 800-mile system.
The California High-Speed Rail Authority's Board of Directors, appointed by the governor and the legislature, is committed to managing the project at the highest level of fiscal accountability. An independent and qualified peer review committee will also review the planning, engineering, and financing of the California High-Speed Rail Authority's plans. Periodic audits will be performed by the state auditor.
California is on track to the future. Clean, electrically powered high-speed trains are the best means for meeting Californians' mobility demand in the 21st century and will put Californians at the forefront of the emerging green economy.
By providing unprecedented, safe, comfortable, environmentally sustainable travel from city center to city center, California is leading the way into America's future. The future begins now.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. I've just got a very brief PowerPoint that I'll go through with the federal application, so we've just recently submitted. If we can get that up in a second. Thank you. So, as has already been discussed, November was a very historic event for the implementation of high-speed rail in California with the passage of Prop 1A, and thank you all for your efforts of making that happen in the state. And it was really not only historic in California, but it was a historic moment for high-speed rail implementation in this country, since California became the first state to actually put up significant funds to implement high-speed rail in this nation. $9 billion for the statewide system and another $0.95 billion to improve existing services that feed into the high-speed train system. As the video described, the statewide system shown in blue on this map is about 800 miles, serving all of California's major metropolitan areas using the latest steel wheel on steel rail technology. The system will operate at speeds of up to 220 miles per hour. In November, there was another historic moment for the implementation of high-speed rail, and that was with the election of President Obama, who is a true champion for this mode of transportation and for intercity rail as a whole. As you pointed out, the President has identified at least 10 corridors throughout the country that have great potential for implementing successful modern high-speed rail systems, and California being one of those 10 corridors. The President has noted that building high-speed rail in America is easier and better than expanding our existing freeway and aviation system to meet intercity demands. To show his commitment to implementing high-speed rail and intercity improvements in the country, the President in February signed the stimulus package to put in $8 billion for high-speed rail and intercity improvements. And I think what was really significant was he recognized to the public that this is not the program, this is just a sign of the beginning of a commitment to actually have a national program to implement high-speed rail throughout the country. A key element of this program is that for these stimulus funds, there are some significant dates that need to be made. The funds to actually implement construction for this is that they have to be committed by September, the end of September 2012, and actually the environmental work and the certification of the environmental work needs to be completed by September 2011. That greatly narrows the number of projects, even for our effort, of what actually could compete for these initial federal funds for high-speed rail. This map shows the 11 federally designated high-speed corridors around the country, which you can see that California is one of these. There's also another corridor in the west, the Northwest Corridor that links Oregon and Washington, actually even goes up to Canada. Another corridor in the Texas area, Florida, in the Midwest, a hub that's focused around Chicago. And then there are several corridors along the eastern part of the United States and a Gulf corridor as well through Louisiana. California applied for $5.8 billion of the total $8 billion in funding that was dedicated to high-speed rail and intercity improvements. I should note that the FRA got in over about $57 billion worth of applications from over 34 states for this $8 billion. California's application was actually done in two parts. The first part was for Track 1, which was submitted in August, where we applied for $1.1 billion for near-term improvements, mostly for improvements to the existing conventional intercity services. On October 2nd, the state requested $4.7 billion for developing the new high-speed train system for California, and this includes engineering and environmental work for the statewide system, and then construction resources for 4 sections of the Phase 1 portion of the system between San Francisco and Anaheim. And I'll go into a little more detail on that $4.7 billion. That includes about $280 million to complete the environmental work that's needed towards construction. That's for the statewide system. In addition to the 800-mile system, it also includes money to do the environmental work for the Altamont Corridor Rail project as well, which we are doing with local partners for the linkage between Stockton and San Jose via the Altamont Pass. For the construction funds, about $1 billion for the section between San Francisco and San Jose. And this money would result in immediate near-term improvement, vastly improving the existing Caltrain service along that corridor. About $460 million towards the section between Merced and Fresno, and about $820 million for the section between Fresno and Bakersfield. About $2.2 billion for the section between Los Angeles and Anaheim, and that would result in the complete infrastructure needed for high-speed rail, with the exception of electrification. Now, we believe with the authority, and as the governor does, and as the governor said in his press conference on October 2nd, that California is in a great position to get a substantial share of this money for stimulus of this first $8 billion. We think that for a number of reasons. In terms of a true high-speed system, which has been said here by you, that we are ahead of anywhere else in the nation in terms of the development, in the planning, and in the environmental clearance as well, meeting these critical environmental clearance states. We are further ahead than any other state. Also, I think most critically is that we are the only state that has the matching funds, so that we actually can match dollar for dollar. Any dollar that the federal government puts forth to California, we can match with state funds or local funds. And as a part of this application, the governor has pledged to do that. So that's a part of our application. In addition, we have great support from local business, environmental, and governmental agencies for these applications as well, and we've gotten lots of letters of support throughout the state for the California application, so we think that's important as well. And then this is my final slide that just sort of reiterates what was in the video, is that, again, for key sections of the system where we are looking for the early construction, we will have the environmental work completed by 2011 and looking to break ground by the end of 2011 on those sections. 2015, being able to test the first prototype train sets and be able to do high-speed testing through the Central Valley in that section. And then, even though I've been talking in this federal application, we're going for construction of sections of the system, but really the goal here is by no later than 2020 to be able to have the full system between San Francisco and Anaheim operational by 2020. And here's my contact information, and All of our applications, the complete applications, are available on our website, as is all of our previous environmental work and the work that we're currently working on. We actually have the full Phase 1 work is all underway for all the sections that you saw in the video. They're all underway. The Phase 2 work will be completely underway. LA to San Diego is currently in scoping right now as we speak. Sacramento to Merced will begin scoping a little bit later this year. In Altamont, we just got the NOI and NOP out today, so that scoping will happen and begin in a couple of weeks. So we have a lot of work underway, and we will keep the public apprised, and all the documents that we do will be through our website, which is www.cahighspeedrail.ca.gov.
Well, we want to thank you, and obviously the public is behind this effort, as is evident of their voting for 1A, and we know that our ability to have matching revenues and resources for the federal funds that the President is putting out on the table for high-speed rail is a plus for us. So we're very proud that your company, your association, your organization has continued to provide the leadership to make sure that California shines on high-speed rail. Mrs. Galgiani.
Yes. Dan, congratulations on all your great work. And I think we need to brag up the High Speed Rail Authority, too, because out of the 11 countries in the world that have high-speed trains, California has memorandums of understanding with 5 of those countries who are assisting us with information about technology and consultation and advice and so forth. So I think that that's really important to recognize, because that really puts us ahead of others. I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
You mentioned that the $2.2 billion for LA to Anaheim would take it all the way to construction with the exception of electrification. Right. Does that mean that the Metrolink or whatever system it would be other than that would actually still be able to run?
Yes,
on
actually,
that
currently those are not electrified systems. So yes, they would be able to run on that without the electrification. One of the key criteria for the stimulus funds is that even though certainly we expect more funds to come through federal and to be able to match that with state dollars and be able to complete the entire system, one of the criteria on the stimulus funds is that if there was no other funding ever put up for high-speed rail, that whatever gets built could be used by other services, by existing services. And so that's what we've done. And in LA to San Diego, that yes, it can be used by Metrolink and other Surfliner services in there. And we actually have sign-off from LA Metro that they would actually take advantage of that infrastructure.
And for the other areas, I know that in the Central Valley, the plan is to have Amtrak run on that track to give it the independent utility. The money that we're asking for, does that dollar amount actually take us to the point where Amtrak could run?
Yes, it would. And again, I just want to clarify, we don't ever expect that necessarily that Amtrak would ever run on that infrastructure. That's sort of the worst case scenario, that if, for example, there was no other funding, the funding never materialized. With our current plan, that we'd have the whole infrastructure invested so that you would be able to always use just high-speed train equipment. This is a worst-case scenario. If there was never ever any additional funds for high-speed rail, then yes, that infrastructure would be all ready to use, that Amtrak trains could then run on that equipment with their current equipment, and they'd be able to run at speeds of about 110 plus miles per hour on that.
Okay, and then the dollar amount that we've asked for San Francisco to San Jose would allow Caltrain to run, and it would take us up to the point where Caltrain could actually be running on the system as well?
Caltrain, and Caltrain already is running. This would mean a greatly improved Caltrain. That includes electrification, positive control for the trains, which is extremely important for safety and reliability, and grade separation improvements as well, in addition to vast improvements to both the terminus station locations at San Francisco and San Jose. So all these improvements would lead towards being able to run high-speed trains on the peninsula, but they bring immediate improvement to the Caltrain services.
Great, and that allows us to achieve some immediate revenue while we're working on the whole statewide system as well. Thank you.
Will the Los Angeles-Anaheim phase be one of the earlier phases of high-speed implementation?
Yeah, well, actually, all the ones that we put forth, we would hope to be early phases. So the 4 construction pieces that we're talking about would all be conceivably being able to be constructed around the same time period if we got the funds.
Right.
So, yes, we view that as an early implementation piece. And actually, the LA to Anaheim section, we were able to begin the project level environmental work on that before we were able to start any other piece. And part of the reason was that is that we had the first local partner that we had, actually regional partner we had, was in Orange County, OCTA, who actually put up significant resources to move forward with the environmental work that we could then match with state dollars. So the environmental work in that corridor is further ahead of any other part of the state, and so we're in good shape in that state in that piece of the system to be able to meet the stimulus guidelines and to move that section forward.
And that should probably be a model for other local governments who are interested and enthusiastic about moving forward and the implementation of high-speed rail construction. If their local governments could consider what has occurred in the Anaheim area, they would be much further ahead and prepared to do high-speed. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and appreciate your support
Yes.
on this effort of ours. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we look forward to working with you on some of the other countries that you're consulting with and seeing the various forms of high-speed rail and high-speed rail technology that they have.
Great. No, it's important to be able to do that because we do need to learn from what they've achieved throughout the world is amazing, and we do need to learn everything we can from that so that we're able to duplicate that here in California.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you. And with that, I want to talk about passenger rail. We have a goal overall to talk about passenger rail through the various regions of the state, Southern California, Northern California, and now we want to look at the Central Valley area, Sacramento area. And with that, I'd like to introduce four panelists, Bill Bronte, who is the Chief and Division of Rail at Caltrans for the Intercity Rail Program. Also, Mike Wiley, General Manager of Sacramento Regional Transit District, and also David Kotrosky, Deputy Manager Director of the Capital Corridor, as well as Matt Carpenter, Director of Transportation Planning, Sacramento Area Council of Governments, and the Metropolitan Transportation Plan for 2035 and the current and future stimulus projects in the Sacramento region. And with that, if you all will come up. So we'd like to know the health of passenger rail in this region, and we know that you gentlemen are eminently prepared and qualified to let us know how our passenger rail is doing.
You're first, aren't you, Bill? Okay. I think I just got nominated by acclamation to be the first one off. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Bill Bronte, and as you noted, I am the Chief of the Division of Rail. The division, at least in Caltrans, is responsible for the management, operation, and funding of three of the intercity passenger rail corridors here in California. I'd like to thank the committee for this opportunity to come here and give you a little bit of an update on where we're going and the impact the economy has had on the state's intercity passenger rail system. To kind of provide some background, California is home to the second, third, and sixth busiest intercity passenger rail corridors in the country. The state funds these services and has since 1976 under a provision of the original Amtrak Act that allowed states to contract with Amtrak to provide intrastate intercity services. So the services you see in various parts of the country or in the state are ones that Caltrans is funding directly. In 1976, we initially funded the first 2 trains per day down in Southern California, or actually it was basically one round trip between LA and San Diego. In the 38 years since then, we have grown to 68 daily trains, or 34 round trips. More than 20% of all Amtrak passengers ride California's intercity intrastate system. Only New York has more passengers generated than here in California. And of the 14 states that direct or contract directly with Amtrak, we provide 1/2 of the ridership. Now, the services we fund differ a little bit than the ones that Gus talked about earlier with Metrolink and ACE. Those are commuter services, and those are typically focused on services that are within a region. Their trips tend to be peak period. They're like the home-to-work types of trips. They have more frequent stops, and the density per car is significantly greater than what you would see on an intercity train. Our train trips, on the other hand, are ones that go between regions. They tend to be rather long. They're not focused on peak period travel. They basically go the entire day. We also have fewer stops, and probably a good example of the differences between the services is like in Southern California that you're aware of. On the Metrolink trains, the average trip length is only about 30 miles. The average trip length on an intercity train here in California ranges from 65 on the Capital Corridor, which David will talk about, to 140 miles, which is the average trip length on a service that goes through Assemblymember Galgiani's district on the San Joaquin Corridor. Our 3-state services include the Pacific Surfliner Corridor that parallels the coast between San Diego through Los Angeles and on up to Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo. This is the nation's second busiest intercity rail corridor with about 2.6 million annual passengers. Only the Northeast Corridor is busier, and at times last summer there were actually more people riding on the Pacific Surfliner Corridor than there were on the Northeast Corridor on their Acela services. The Capital Corridor I'll kind of let David talk about, but that is the second busiest corridor in the country. I hate stealing David's thunder, so I'm going to be very quiet about that one. All right. The San Joaquin Corridor basically runs down the valley connecting either Sacramento or the Bay Area with Stockton and on down to Bakersfield. San Joaquin Corridor services are kind of unique in that about half of our passengers actually have a part of their trip on a bus. We have connecting bus services that goes all the way up into Oregon and over into Nevada to Reno and also to Las Vegas. So about half of our passengers have a portion of the trip on the bus. And again, in the federal fiscal year that just concluded, we had just under about 1 million passengers riding that particular services. We've experienced sustained growth through most of this decade. Between July of 2000 and July of 2008, California's population grew approximately 10%. During that same period, vehicle miles of travel grew only about 6.5%, which means people weren't taking as many trips. Intercity rail ridership, on the other hand, grew by more than 56%. During that period of time, the total number of passenger miles, the number of miles a passenger was going, grew approximately 40%. The current economic downturn, however, has frankly blunted or almost stopped that growth. For the first time in more than a decade, ridership on the state's intercity passenger rail system declined on a year-to-year basis. For the just concluded federal fiscal year that ended on September 30th, ridership statewide declined 7.5% compared to the prior federal fiscal year. The Pacific Surfliner Corridor in Southern California suffered the greatest decline at about 10.6%, followed by the Capital Corridor with a 5.5% drop, and the San Joaquin Corridor down the valley experienced only a 2.2% decline in ridership. Now, part of that we have to kind of temper it a little bit in that the prior year saw huge increases in ridership nationwide and within the state. Intercity services on a statewide basis had grown 13%. So we're comparing a down year to a phenomenal year in some ways. So it's not quite as bad as people might think. But again, it still marked the first time since, in more than a decade that we've had that kind of a decline in ridership. Now, just to digress a little bit, and I'm sorry the Assemblymember Galgiani left, I find it interesting that in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Corridor, that's the sixth busiest corridor in the country, but it goes through Stockton, Merced, Modesto, Bakersfield. The Central Valley has a unemployment rate of about 15%. The true unemployment is probably closer to 30%. It's home of the mortgage meltdown, yet that was the one corridor that experienced the lowest decline in ridership. One would have assumed it would have experienced the greatest. So I think it says a lot about the base ridership that intercity passenger rail has here in California. California's ridership and revenue declines are pretty much consistent with the nationwide trends and are due to job losses, wage reductions, and people scaling back on discretionary purchases like travel. Nationally, Amtrak's ridership is down 5.4%, and on their premier Acela corridor in the Northeast Corridor for the last year, it's down nearly 12%. Approximately 75 to 80% of the intercity trips tend to be discretionary. As we watched our state's unemployment rate climb from about 6.5% in October of 2008 to 12% on a statewide basis this last September, we watched our ridership decline by as much as 15% per month, particularly on the Pacific Surfliner corridor. Now, this has some very interesting implications, and probably Mike, and I wish Gus were still here, we'll talk about it a bit more. But because of the nature of most of the commuter and light rail types of trips, they tend to be the home to work, and they've been hit most severely by the economic downturn. For example, in Southern California, we are consistently seeing monthly ridership in the neighborhood of 25% on Metrolink and coaster services. And although most economists believe the economy has hit bottom and is beginning to recover, most projections are that California's recovery is going to be slower and less robust than the nation as a whole. California's agreement with Amtrak for the federal fiscal year that started on October 1st reflects that very soft economy. We are projecting flat ridership, or about 400,000 riders a year less on a statewide basis, and our revenue levels are projected to be about $4 million less than they were in the prior year, and that's down since the budget process began this last July. Given the level of uncertainty about the nature of the recovery, the Department is working with Amtrak and our stakeholders to develop plans to address revenue shortfalls if the recovery doesn't meet the expectations. The plans under review include additional fare increases beyond those already scheduled, reductions in station staffing, changing equipment maintenance and cleaning cycles, and eliminating or reducing call center and reservation center support. Although it's being reviewed, the option we want to avoid is reducing our existing services. We don't believe you can cut your way to improved ridership. The cost of ridership and revenues and the cost of reestablishing services and markets are ultimately greater than any savings you're going to be able to generate in the short run. There's two other reasons that I think it's important that we not cut our services back. First is at the federal level. There's very much an emphasis as we go forward through the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act and the stimulus funding that they're looking for a state commitment to the continuation of services. So it makes very difficult to go forward either at the state level or at the local level asking for more federal money when at the same time you're cutting back your existing base. The feds tend not to like that when they do their evaluations. And the other one is the role that intercity is going to play in the development of the high-speed intercity network. As Mark mentioned earlier, you have to develop an integrated network that includes intercity rail with high-speed rail with the individual transit systems. So you need to have that network. You can't develop a network by cutting down. The public needs to view rail as a viable alternative when you're talking about greenhouse gas reductions and the SB 375 emphasis on the development of enhanced land use planning. Cutting the system doesn't really encourage that type of use. Of the Caltrans side, we're working very hard because we are going to be the feeder network to the high-speed rail system. The spine system is going to go from San Francisco to Merced to Bakersfield and to Los Angeles. We will be providing the connections from Sacramento to Merced or Sacramento to San Jose as a connection to the high-speed rail network. We're also going to be the feeder system in the valley as the system is developed. And as Dan alluded to, we also are going to be hopefully a beneficiary of the initial development that they have through the Central Valley. Again, we're going to be the feeder network, and our emphasis at this point is to position the state's intercity rail system to be the feeder into the high-speed rail network. And to that end, the department has been working with the High-Speed Rail Authority, both on the development of the applications that Dan alluded to earlier, and to assist them in their very aggressive timeline for preliminary engineering and environmental. We're working with the High-Speed Rail Authority and developing an MOU that will allow Caltrans to bring some of its expertise and oversight ability in the area of preliminary engineering and environmental oversight into the process so they can meet their overall time schedule. So with that, I'll pass off to whichever of my other panel members would like to go next.
All right. Thank you for that. Bill?
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Davis and Committee Member Torres. My name is David Katrowski. I am Deputy Managing Director for the Capital Corridor Joint Powers Authority. I want to thank you for letting the Capital Corridor speak before you again this year. Last year, I think it was in a different room. I got a little lost coming in here, but found my way. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if it's been loaded, but I think you received copies. It's got a black cover on it, and did we get copies to them? Yes. Okay. Well, I can probably start in with that. Let me just give you a brief overview of the Capital Corridor Service and the Joint Powers Authority. The Capital Corridor Service is an intercity passenger rail service, as Bill mentioned, as part of the state's 3 corridors. We're a 170-mile route running from San Jose to Oakland, San Francisco, and up to Sacramento and the Sierra foothills. We connect 3 Northern California metro areas. We serve the second largest population area in the western United States. And best thing of all is that we provide free transfers with all our local connecting transit agencies at all our stations. This goes back to what Bill has been talking about, what Dan was talking about, and Mark was talking about, the connectivity. And I'm going to thread that through a lot of my presentation this morning. The Capital Corridor JPA assumed management of the Capital Corridor Service in October of '98. We are a small management team that is focused on the customer. We want to provide a safe and convenient service for the passengers, which will in return provide an enjoyable and stress-free ride for them to keep them coming back. We run this service as a business, and we are results-oriented. Through the investments that we've been able to make through state funding, we are now the 3rd busiest corridor in the Amtrak's national system. Number 2, as mentioned, was the Pacific Surfliner, and the number 1 service is the premier Northeast Corridor service. As part of, there we go. That's see if I'm doing this right. There we go. We got there. Now I'm here. When we're talking about California's intercity passenger rail program, I won't try not to repeat what Bill was bringing but the intercity rail program, all 3 corridors were established by the voters. And Propositions 108, 116 helped make the system develop and also develop the trust fund for the continued operation and investment into this program. So it's by the vote of the Californians that have developed this program. It's been instituted by Caltrans and the Capital Corridor JPA. And California is recognized as the leader in intercity passenger rail. It started with and continues with the support of the public through, as I mentioned, Propositions 108, 116, and then further supported through Propositions 42, 1A, and then as Gus was mentioning, Prop 1B, which includes $400 million for the intercity rail program, and most recently Prop 1A, the High Speed Rail Authority. Once these people get out and start riding their trains, they're hooked. And if we can provide them with a safe and convenient service, they'll keep coming back. As far as what we were talking about, the perfect storm, the stars aligned in 2008. We had enormous growth. Our fare box ratio went up to 55%. We had a commitment from Union Pacific for on-time performance, and we kept on seeing that continued improvement. Here you can see a 10-year snapshot of our ridership. We've gone from 463,000 riders a year back in 1998 up to 1.7 million in 2009. So it's 2008. So that's 10 years of continuous ridership growth. And the main reason behind that is the trend line there is the ridership. The boxes, the blue box that go from left to right is the increase in frequency. If you can continue to increase incrementally your level of service, they'll start coming in, because then they can throw away the schedule. They don't need to know there's a train every hour. On the Capital Corridor, we run 32 trains a day. It's hourly service. We have regular riders, as Bill was talking about. We also have discretionary riders because we have trains running 365 days a year. So we run on holidays, we run on weekends, we run from our first train pulls out 4:30 in the morning and it ties up at 11 o'clock at night. Our revenue, as you can see here, we've had over 20 fare increases since we've been doing it. We do fare increases twice a year, whether we like it or not. But it has proven to be successful, because each time we do a fare increase, we try and provide some type of service improvement, be it some type of track improvement, minor improvements, or significant service expansion plans. Our on-time performance, we're seeing a trend line going up, and that's been the commitment from Union Pacific Railroad, who dispatches and owns the territory and does the maintenance. We have no slow orders on our service. We run between Oakland and Sacramento in less than 2 hours. You can get into San Francisco in about 2 hours from the station here in Sacramento. Let's see. Here we go. Now we start to see the low tide. Towards over a year ago, we started to see on the horizon that there was a storm coming, and we saw that in our capital improvement program. It was a diversion of all the PTA funds started to reduce our ability to make improvements out there for either maintenance or service expansion, or, as Bill was talking about, trying to get more money for our rolling stock. What we have seen as far as this low tide, as I mentioned, is the first law of transit dynamics. What goes up must come down. So we saw we were riding the perfect wave, and then we got hit by a tsunami, and that was we've seen a 5.5% decrease in ridership, as well as almost a 2% decrease in revenue. I'm lucky our revenue didn't decrease more than that. As Bill had mentioned, we would have been in some serious trouble. So it's different. If I can make a closing statement with the low tide, it's difficult to manage a successful program without the steady capital investment of money. And the PTA funds are our sole source. Everything up to this point now has been strictly state funded. There's been no federal funds coming in at all. It's been through the voters of California putting in those propositions and setting up that trust fund and the public transportation account. That pays for our operations, and that pays for our capital improvement program. This chart is a little bit difficult to read, but it's not all bad news. We look back 2 years ago in 2007, and we're 15% above where we were. We are 15% above now where we were 2 years ago in ridership, and revenue we're up 22%. So it's bad, but it's not horrible. Our trend line, if you look at it over the last 3 years, is still going up. And we're starting to see a little bit of a rebound with some of our conductor counts. I check our conductor counts once a week, and so our ridership is starting to pick up compared to where we were in October last year. Responses to our economic downturn have been simply, we've been lucky enough to get some Prop 1B funds, $17 million. It's created some jobs, but not enough, obviously. But the $17 million is going to do some long program work that was been out there for 2 or 3 years and been continually deferred, but now we're going to be able to do some track improvements and some safety and security upgrades. What was mentioned before was the Recovery Act through the Obama administration, through the Federal Railroad Administration, through Bill's office. The Capital Corridor applied for $165 million program in August of what they call Track 1, job creation projects. It's going to create 287 jobs. What we're particularly proud of is a $65 million request for Recovery Act funds, but $100 million in local matching funds, and that's where I'd like to start to shine a light on this presentation here. What we want to do is continue to get a stable source of state funding in, because with the Recovery Act, there's going to be continued investment from the federal government in intercity as well as high-speed rail trains. In order to do that, you're going to need a match, and the minimum is a 20% match. And what we'd like to do is match those federal funds with some type of state funds here. And what we'd like is the PTA account is our sole source. It's a trust fund, and we want to start working with you to make sure that those funds become available. One of the things we've started to forecast is that even without service expansion and a moderate growth of 5% a year in ridership, in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to have standing room only in some of our trains. And this is a safety concern. As Bill says, these people are traveling over an hour standing, and it's a safety concern and passenger convenience. We'll start to actually see a reduction in ridership, and that's something we don't want to have. So what we need is rolling stock. We need it on all 3 of our intercity rail corridors. And what we need to do with that is we have some Prop 1B money that's available. We also like to go and leverage some of those federal funds as well. As a little snapshot, you can't read that, but we have a $1 billion program over 10 years. What we're trying to get is $250 million match. That's $25 million a year over the next 10 years through the state public transportation account. That's not a lot of money, but it's going to leverage $750 million in federal funds that will come here. It will generate jobs, not only construction jobs, but permanent operating jobs as well. So, in closing, I'd like to say thank you all very much for allowing us, the Capital Corridor, to speak. And I just want to remind you that intercity passenger rail, I was just at a conference recently, and they're talking about this connectivity, and they pointed to California. And this was a conference in D.C. with everybody from around the world, and they're saying high-speed rail, intercity passenger rail, and transit agencies, the money should go to those that have all 3 operating. And they pointed to California. They say they have a successful investment in intercity passenger rail, and they have a successful program that they're showing in their applications for high-speed rail. And we are a green alternative. One of the highlights I'd like to leave behind is that intercity passenger rail emits 66% less greenhouse gases per passenger. As a sample, you can ride 300 miles on one of our trains, and in the same amount of greenhouse gases would only get you 100 miles on a car. So that's something in closing I'd like to say thank you very much for your time. And now, as we're going from the state to the regional, I'll hand it over to Mike for the local viewpoint.
Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chair Davis and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. I'm Mike Wiley. I'm the General Manager, CEO for the Sacramento Regional Transit District. We're your local operator here in Sacramento, operating both buses and light rail service. We operate about 230 buses and 76 light rail vehicles today. We started light rail service in 1987, so we've been operating light rail service for 22 years. Our rail service has grown tremendously over that time. Most recently, our growth has really been focused since 2003, approximately doubling the size of the service in those 6 years since 2003. In terms of ridership today, and we are on a fiscal year basis that runs from June through July, as the state is. Our ridership peaked in last fiscal year at an all-time high. We transported over 34 million passengers system-wide, bus and rail, with just over 50% of that, just over 17 million riders on rail service. Our rail service, in fact, has grown tremendously over the years. Today, system-wide, again, we transport over 120,000 passengers a day, with over 62,000 passengers a day on our rail service. Ridership has, as I mentioned, has grown with the expansion of this system. Just about 5 to 6 years ago, we carried about 32,000 a day on rail, and as I indicated today, we're transporting over 62,000 per day. And ridership certainly peaked last year. You've heard earlier about other growth in ridership. We were no exception with our ridership increases were driven by several factors. Probably paramount was the significant increase in gas prices. but also here in Sacramento during the months of June and July. Over a year ago, we had a major construction project where Interstate 5, we called the boat section, was shut down. The transit systems throughout the region actually responded very, very well to work closely with Caltrans to provide enhanced service, and that led to increased ridership. On our service here in Sacramento, however, we saw a continued growth in ridership, even though as gas prices a year ago began to decline. If you recall, in September a year ago, we started to see the drop in gas prices, and that certainly continued through the next 6 months or so. Our ridership stayed strong, continued to grow through the month of January and February of this year. And then we started to see significant increases in unemployment. We started to experience increased number of days off. We affectionately call state furlough days here in Sacramento. And we started to see a decline in ridership that started in late February, March of this current calendar year. The economy has had a fairly significant impact on our ability to provide service here in Sacramento. Our sales tax, and we have two sources of sales tax: state sales tax, which flows to us through the Transportation Development Act, or the Local Transportation Fund, which is a 1/4 cent of statewide sales tax that comes back to transit operators throughout the state. And then, of course, our local sales tax here we refer to as Measure A, which was renewed by our voters several years ago. Combined, we saw an annual decrease, actual decrease in sales tax of $24 million a year. That represents a 30% decline, or about 16% of our operating budget was lost due to the decline in sales tax from those two sources. Combine that with the loss of the State Transit Assistance Fund that we've absorbed over $76 million in the last several years. We've seen a decrease in our operating budget of about 33%. Our current annual operating budget is $140 million, and we've seen a decrease of about $50 million from those two sources on an annual basis. That's had a significant impact on our ability to maintain services. During the past 9 months, we've experienced 2 fare increases to help make up for some of that loss. Obviously, we have done a tremendous job in controlling our expenditures, and as David mentioned earlier, the last thing we want to do is to cut service, and we've been able to avoid any service reductions on our rail operation. We have had to absorb some level of bus service reduction. Over the past several years, we've absorbed approaching about a 10% reduction on bus service, but we've been able to avoid reductions in rail service. We've also experienced, as a result of the downturn in the economy, significant delays in our ability to provide needed infrastructure improvements. We have a project that many people don't hear much about, but it will enhance our ability to provide peak period service in our northeast quarter of our rail service from downtown to the intersection of Interstate 80 and Watt Avenue. It's the northeast portion of our Blue Line. We've completed about 2/3 of that project, which is several phases of double tracking and expansion of our maintenance facility. But the final phase of that project is hopefully temporarily on hold as we wait for additional TCRP funds to flow. It's one of the last projects. We have 2 projects in Sacramento that are still to be funded with TCRP revenues. I cannot add the additional peak capacity. We will operate in the future when that last 1-mile segment of double track is complete. We will add additional peak trains operating in limited stop service. So not only will we add capacity, we'll speed the trains up, making them more attractive for those peak hour riders. That project is on hold until we receive those funds. And then the other major project that has been significantly delayed is the extension of our light rail line south. We have a 4.3-mile extension of our Blue Line that runs south. It currently terminates at Meadowview Road. That will add 4.3 miles, 4 additional stations, and a new terminal station at Consumma Server College. we have a tremendous partner with Los Rios Community College District. We have a fair program that has been just tremendously successful with the Los Rios Community College District, and as a result, the Los Rios Community College District is donating all of the land to us. They're helping us with the construction. We're utilizing their unique construction opportunity to build the facilities on the campus as well, which will significantly reduce the cost. But because of the state's inability to deliver TCRP funds, we have had to change our finance model for delivering that project. And now we're looking at issuing our own funding mechanisms, financed through fair revenue, to pay for our local share, a portion of our local share of that project. And as we have reevaluated that funding mechanism, it has in fact caused a delay for that particular project. And what you heard earlier is true for us as well, that as these projects get delayed, it increases the capital cost to deliver those projects. As we prepare for the recovery, we are not exclusively focused on delay. Recently, in August of this year, our board, after a 2-year process, adopted a new vision for transit in Sacramento. We call it Transit Action. It's a very robust, very new view of what transit should be in Sacramento. And it was developed in concert with, and you'll hear, I'm sure, from Matt Carpenter next, it was developed in concert with our new Metropolitan Transportation Plan and our new local vision for land use growth here in Sacramento that we affectionately refer to as a blueprint. We have developed a new vision for transit that will deliver an extremely robust level of service, and obviously resources are critical to the delivery of that. At the same time, we're also focused on continuing to deliver on past promises. I mentioned our South Line Phase 2. We're on the verge of entering final design with the federal government's approval. We expect to be under construction on the first phases of that project, hopefully in late spring of this next year, and we will deliver that in 2013. But at the same time, we've also looked at new and innovative ways to continue to expand other projects. Several years ago, we extended our light rail system to serve the Sacramento Valley Station, which is the Sacramento station and one of the most heavily utilized stations of the Capital Corridor service. We extended light rail to Sacramento Valley Station, and ridership has grown to over 1,000 passengers a day that serve that station now. This last October 12th, 10 days ago, we held a groundbreaking ceremony for the first phase of our ultimate extension of light rail from downtown Sacramento to Sacramento International Airport, a 1.1-mile extension we call the Green Line to the River District. We initiated that project as a design-build project. We will be in design and construction and complete the construction of that project in 1 year. We will deliver that project in November of 2010. And we're doing that with all local funds. We decided to, for the time being, remove ourselves from the federal funding process for that particular project to expedite the project and deliver it sooner versus later. At the same time, we're continuing to update all of our plans for the Green Line extension to the airport, and we hope to deliver that project by 2017. Well ahead of the delivery of high-speed rail, whose terminal location will be the jumping-off point for the Green Line, connecting the Sacramento Valley Station to the airport with connections through high-speed rail to the rest of the state. And that's how we're looking ahead. We want to be prepared when the economy begins to turn. We are completing all of the environmental documentation and all of the engineering on other projects as well. So that as soon as the funds begin to flow once again and sales tax revenues begin to turn around, we will be ready to deliver on these projects. And that's our focus today.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. And with that, I would welcome Matt Carpenter, who is the Director of Transportation Planning for the Sacramento Area Council of Governments.
Good morning, Chairman Davis and members of the Select Committee.
Thank you.
I appreciate this opportunity to come before you today and explain how the Sacramento Region's Metropolitan Transportation Plan, also known as the MTP 2035, supports an expanded future for transit in the region, and how supportive land use development and higher levels of funding are really essential to realize this vision. In the spring of 2008, the SACOG board unanimously adopted the MTP 2035, the region's first long-range plan to explicitly propose a range of policies and associated strategies specifically designed to integrate with a blueprint-influenced smart growth land use pattern. The region's early and serious commitment to integrated land use and transportation planning is evident in the diversity of mobility options presented in the MTP that serve the shorter trips made possible through more compact and mixed land uses in the blueprint growth. And since that time, there's been subsequent planning efforts, including Regional Transit's Visionary Transit Action Plan, to realize some of these opportunities. By prioritizing MTP 2035 transportation investments to serve the blueprint land uses, we realized some important policy outcomes, including greenhouse gas reductions, urban revitalization, farm-to-market connections, and transportation mobility. Policy outcomes that could only be achieved through concert with one another. And through the MTP and blueprint process, SACOG has also learned a great deal about the very close connections between increased transit and supportive land uses. More detailed information is provided in pages 2 to 4 of your testimony, and some of these findings we've identified include, first of all, just a large increase in transit service hours and boardings are possible when the service is matched to compact and mixed-use land uses. A second finding was that there's a real diversity of transit services are needed in order to attract both the transit-dependent and choice riders. Passenger rail is a key aspect in the MTP of attracting choice riders through modes such as intercity rail, light rail, and streetcars. Some of our area transit operators, including leadership from Regional Transit, are already moving forward on that diversity of choices. A third finding we had was that an improvement in overall transit productivity is possible when supportive land uses guide service planning decisions. And finally, a decline in congested travel is possible through focused peak or commute services, because when you have a congested roadway, even a small change or migration from autos to transit can make a big difference in serving congestion, resolving some of the congestion. Now, realizing the MTP 2035 transit vision for the Sacramento region will really require some sustained funding from local, state, and federal sources. Much of the discussion today is, of course, centered around that. And with local and state sources under particular strain, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, funding this year has offered a critical infusion of more than $38 million in capital and operating funds for the region's transit operators. The largest transit awards in our region went towards preventative maintenance or operations, as well as new bus and rail vehicles to maintain and expand service. An additional $20 million in ARRA funding was awarded to the Sacramento Intermodal Project that represents both a signature land use plan and a multimodal transportation hub that includes bus, light rail, intercity, and potentially high-speed rail connections. This ARRA funding will go towards critical early improvements at the Intermodal Project and is in addition to the millions of other funds realized already through federal, state, and local sources for that project. An attachment to your testimony identifies or offers more detail about all the different transit investments in our Sacramento region. Now, future ARRA funding opportunities for the SACOG region include anticipated investments in high-speed rail and intercity rail throughout California. As already discussed, a portion of the $8 billion ARRA high-speed rail account promises opportunities to Northern California, as well as potential funding through the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, or PRIA account. Strengthening intercity connections along the Capitol Corridor to the Bay Area and the San Joaquin Corridor to Stockton and further points south is especially important for the SACOG region. ARRA funding for intercity rail services will be an important complement to state investments in these lines through the anticipated $21 to $25 million in Proposition 1A coming to our region. These funds will likely support not only high-speed rail connections in the region, but additional network connections to strategic light rail investments by the Sacramento Regional Transit District. Additional Proposition 1A funding, we think, can really support vital improvements along the intercity rail connections to our west and south. Now, we've already realized through some of these findings through MTP what a real opportunity there is, that how ARRA funding for passenger rail services can be a catalyst for private investment along rail corridors and set the stage for the region to capture other sources of federal funding in the future, including opportunities through reauthorization we're already starting to pursue. Now, Despite the success the region has had in implementing elements of the MTP 2035 vision, there are some significant challenges to confront. A fundamental challenge is funding transit services early enough so that they can effectively stimulate the shift in land use patterns to build substantial amounts of higher density, mixed use, walkable developments near high quality transit service. Expecting developers to just build transit-oriented developments on the expectations that sometime in the future funds will become available is really not realistic. We have to find a way to do both at the same time. And transit and supportive land uses have a strong synergistic relationship that is lost if they're not done together. Realizing this relationship as a challenge is really, particularly in our region, because there's a real funding crisis in securing funding. So most critically, the operating funds to run the bus and rail transit services, as you just heard about. Significantly higher levels of funding for transit operations are needed in our region for the expansion envisioned in the MTP 2035 and Regional Transit Action Plan. But on a more hopeful note, there is evidence that elsewhere in the state there has been evidence that those growing transit can be supported through local funding options. At the beginning of our economic crisis in the fall of 2008, we find it encouraging that voters in such diverse places as Los Angeles, Marin County, and even here in West Sacramento did support substantial tax increases dedicated exclusively to increasing transit service. Realizing the synergistic connection between integrated land use and transportation planning is also important as the state plans high-speed rail through the Central Valley. The MTP 2035 planning process suggests the promise of matching high-quality transit service to supportive, compact, and mixed-use land uses with a good jobs housing balance. Such a linkage is essential to minimize wasteful sprawl and a negative impact on air quality and associated environmental impacts. Previously, SACOG has suggested that priority high-speed rail station signings could be given to locations in the Central Valley that have adopted transit-oriented development land use plans that are in place. A land use economic study can be an important initial step to determine the kinds of businesses and jobs that make sense to ensure that high-speed rail in the Central Valley is not primarily a means for long-distance commuter trips. Now, as the Sacramento region adds another 1 million residents by 2035, we will face many decisions about what transportation and land use choices we will offer our changing region. While growth has its challenges and our current economic conditions are compounding these, we have a unique opportunity for transit to finally be a centerpiece of not only the Sacramento region's transportation vision, but also the linchpin for the state's efforts to accommodate growth without compromising a high quality of life. We very much appreciate the Select Committee's interest in these issues and our story. I would be happy to answer any questions you have and provide any follow-up information that you would find helpful. Thank you.
Great. I want to thank each and every one of you for giving us a clear indication of some of the challenges that you've had to deal with in terms of ridership. I know that in our testimony from you last year, one of our government execs went out on a holiday to talk about what your ridership was, and really didn't have a clear indication of how well you were really doing. And I see that even among the presentations today, still there is a vibrant ridership, at least on one line, which is really very encouraging given the challenge that everybody in the country is experiencing on one hand. And then on the other hand, we see that there is a challenge to the ridership for most lines because of the economy today. So here we have a promise, and then we have a hope in transportation in terms of passenger rail in this area. I don't know if my colleagues have any questions, but we'll open up at this time. Kathleen Galgiani.
I just wanted some clarification. You said that it's the Green Line that will connect to the high-speed train in the future, and can you walk us through that again?
Yeah, actually we connect to Sacramento Valley Station today in its current configuration. City of Sacramento, as Matt mentioned, is in the process of expanding that facility to be a full intermodal facility with a much greater capacity. We have identified that station as the terminal station in Sacramento for the high-speed rail, and we currently connect to that today with our GOL line, which operates from the city of Folsom through the east area, through downtown, to that station.
That's the GOL line?
The GOL line from Folsom terminates there today. We just broke ground on the first phase of the Green Line, which will run from that station north across the American River through both South and North of Thomas, terminating at Sacramento International Airport. We just broke ground on that project 10 days ago. So that the intermodal facility and the terminal station for high-speed rail here in Sacramento is the focal point, or a major focal point, for our system. We anticipate a tremendous level of connectivity and transferring between our system of rail and bus, connecting to both the Capital Corridor, which will continue to provide the east-west rail service from here to areas east in Placer County, as well as a high level of service to the Bay Area, and then also connection with high-speed rail at that location, and transfer capabilities from the airport to high-speed rail as well. So there's we see the Green Line being a vital link connecting to high-speed rail and the other services that will originate from that central location.
Great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Great. Again, I'd like to thank each of you for coming to present. We will continuously be engaged in talking about rail throughout the state. In terms of funding, those of us who've been advocates for rail transportation understand how devastating it is when, unfortunately, we have to try to move transportation money when we are also committed to the public to provide transportation. So those of us who are advocates are fighting to make sure that transportation money remains in place for transportation money, in particular rail money, because we value not only passenger rail but also high-speed rail, and we're committed to that. I thank you, and you'll hear from us again as we, throughout the year, will be doing these hearings on various aspects of what it takes to improve and maintain rail in California. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our final presenter will be Paul Dyson, and I'd like to ask him to come up. Paul is the president of Rail Passenger Association of California. And it's a pleasure for us to have him here to give us some remarks on how we can improve public passenger rail transportation in California. Welcome.
Thank
Mr.
you, Chairman
Dyson.
Davis. Thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
I very much appreciate the invitation, and thank you, committee members, for hanging in there. You've done a lot of very patient listening today. And what I was planning on, I have about 10 minutes of comments here, and I don't want to read them all because I hope you'll have a chance to scan through them. And it gets a bit tiresome just listening to somebody droning on. So I'll just skim through some of these things, and then I want to bring up a couple of points from some of the previous presenters, and then ask you if you have any questions. Just as background, Paul Dyson, I'm the president of the Rail Passengers Association of California. We're an all-volunteer body. I bought my own ticket to come here today and took a day off work. And we are affiliated with the National Association of Rail Passengers. We have 3,500 members in California, spread throughout the state. I'm a resident of the city of Burbank, and I'm the chairman of that city's Transportation Commission. I've spent my entire career in the railroad industry. I started in 1968 as a management trainee with British Railways, and since coming to this country, I've had various positions. I'm currently a vice president of a consulting company and freight car leasing company based in Montana. And I could have talked about, there's so many different aspects to this, these problems that I could have talked about today. And the previous presenters obviously talked about the big money issues, which are the things that you'll hear most about. And obviously they concern you greatly. What I want to talk to you about is, and this was drummed into me as a management trainee at BR, you've got to take every journey that you make from the point of view of the first-time passenger. What do they get out of it? Can they make this system work for themselves? Is it user-friendly? Do they know how to go by train? Can they get there when they want to? And in order to sort of flesh that out, I put this comment in large print across the front here. We have no money, so we have to think. This was a New Zealand scientist when he came to England in the 1920s. New Zealand being at the other end of the world in those days, they had to be very resourceful people, and they were used to doing things without any money. And I think that's the climate that we're in now. We don't have a lot of money, and we've got to figure what sort of improvements we can make with very limited resources. What I think we should do is begin by reviewing what we do today. We're not going to have high-speed rail for another 10 years. So we've got to figure out how can we make better use of what we have today to make the system more viable and more user-friendly for passengers. And we face an uphill struggle. People don't like to get out of their cars, right? People enjoy the convenience of their cars. A lot of them are afraid to use public transport. They get confused. How do I buy a ticket? How do I look up the schedule? These people have never traveled by train. There are millions of people in this state who have never traveled by train. How do we get them to use that system and make it user-friendly? I've put in here a couple of real-life examples of the roadblocks that people face when they want to travel by train. I'm going over to Palo Alto tonight. I take a Capital Corridor train to San Jose, but when I get there, I have to buy another ticket. I can't buy a ticket from here to Palo Alto. And likely, I will miss a train going to find a ticket machine in San Jose to get my ticket to Palo Alto. If you've traveled on the Peninsula Service, the same thing happens if you get off at Millbrae to transfer to BART. You see lines of people at the ticket machines at Millbrae to buy the ticket to get onto BART because the Caltrain's machine won't sell them a through ticket to their destination. This is basic blocking and tackling of public transportation, and this is where we are failing. I've got a couple of other examples here. I mean, the Metrolink system is abominable in Southern California for lack of connections. They can't even write a schedule that connects with their own trains, let alone anybody else's. You can take... I can take a train from Burbank, my hometown, down to Los Angeles on a Saturday, but it doesn't connect with a Los Angeles to San Diego Surfliner train on Amtrak. Now, we're short of money. If we can sell more tickets to more people, then some of that deficit problem goes away. If our fare box recovery grows up, if we can add these extra passengers at the margin with no extra cost, we don't have to run a single extra train. We just need to coordinate the schedules better. That's the idea. That's what we want to see. There's no excuse for this lack of cooperation between agencies. And I'm a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but I'm saying that this is your fault as much as anybody's, because you people here at Sacramento have created these JPAs, these Joint Power Authorities, with a specific task to do, so like run a train from Sacramento to San Jose or operate a service from San Diego to San Luis Obispo. That's their job. And they will come here and they'll give you a report, say, yes, our ridership has gone up, we're doing our job, blah, blah, blah. What you haven't told them to do is talk to their neighbors. And what they don't do is talk to their neighbors. I was at the meeting, as I mentioned in here, there was a Losan board meeting in Oceanside about a month ago with the San Diego Transit and commuter people, the Metrolink people, the Losan and Amtrak people. The idea was to start talking, start a conversation about how to coordinate the schedules and make this work. You could see the body language. You could see the hostility. Wow, whose budget is this coming out of? You know, how is my job going to be protected? What if they combine these agencies? What happens to my job? This is some of the things that you're up against. And so just to cut this story short, what we think is needed is some combination of these agencies and either two state rail boards, one for the north and one for the south, to bring together these agencies so that we get economies of scale of purchasing, reduction in administrative overhead, combined ticketing systems so that you can buy a ticket that goes from one place right through to your destination instead of having to stop on the way. And either that or an overall California rail board. We're talking about high-speed rail, and we're excited about it too, although there's an awful lot of devil in the details, but we still want to support that. But we are very concerned that unless we start this whole process now of putting together an integrated plan for service, for schedules, for ticketing, then the high-speed rail is just going to be yet another bolt-on, and it's going to be yet another place where you get on one train and have to buy a ticket to get on another train to get to your destination. These are things that we should start now, and I always mention the analogy of Switzerland. Switzerland, population 9 million, 4 languages. How the heck they get anything done? 20 years ago, they decided they've got, coincidentally, about 80 public transit operators, same as the California Transit Association. 7 or 8 railroads, I think, about 60 bus lines, ferry operators. The federal government mandated a plan to put all of these, not to combine the agencies as such, but to construct a national schedule. You can go from anywhere to anywhere else by bus, by train, by ferry. They all connect roughly every half hour throughout the country. You can get from one place to another. The country would fit roughly between Monterey and Sacramento. That's how big the place is. So that it's not a huge challenge for us. We're asking the same thing. We're asking for you to mandate that these agencies get together and produce a similar plan. It will take probably 10 years, which will be about the time the high-speed rail starts coming in anyway. But we've got to get started on it. Otherwise, we have this dysfunctional system that we have today. It works okay if you happen to be going along a single journey along one route. Say you're going from here to Oakland. That works okay. But if you want to do anything else, if you want to connect, if you want to get a ferry, if you want to get on the Muni, it's another ticket. It's another schedule. I've said enough. But we can do a lot more with what we have, is the whole point.
Thank you.
Without spending a lot of money.
Thank you so much, members. Any comments or remarks?
Well, as someone who has traveled to the Bay Area and tried to use BART and so forth, your point's well taken about being able to connect. It is often difficult to be able to do that. I did want to point out that in the high-speed rail bond, there's $950 million available for connectivity to high-speed rail. Are you familiar with whether any of these agencies are already looking at and making plans for how they might compete for those dollars and what kinds of projects they would be looking at doing, if so?
I think that money is for routes and services that connect with high-speed rail.
Yes.
But it's not specifically for providing that integration of systems. It's for, as far as I know, it's for just hardware and infrastructure improvements with services that connect. And the problem is, one of the problems is that there's such a deficit. Like if you take San Diego County, half of the track down there is still single-track railroad. And they're trying to cram in commuter trains and intercity trains and freight trains all on that line. So they need whatever money might be available from that high-speed bond just for basic railroad hardware, let alone these integrated systems. Initially, I don't think it takes an awful lot of money to produce a schedule that works. Even if you just start with, say, Metrolink and Amtrak and North County Transit in Southern California, you put those three agencies together and say, we want a Southern California regional rail timetable that connects so that you can get... I'll tell you one more example if you've got a minute. When Metrolink awarded I think it was their millionth passenger an award, that passenger was going from Anaheim to Van Nuys, which was a journey through Los Angeles. And you would have thought, golly, yes, there are a lot of people who are not just going to and from Los Angeles. There's all these other journeys as well. But still, they don't provide good connections at Los Angeles Station. So if we had, based on a couple of hubs like Los Angeles, if we had a Southern California regional timetable, use that as sort of an experimental point to get these agencies together and integrate their train services, that would be a good starting. And what does that cost? They issue a new timetable every year anyway. Just takes some staff time to sit down and do it and work it out. Mm-hmm. It means locking them in a room and not letting them leave until they've done it, actually. Is what it means. Okay.
Yeah, I thank you, Mr. Dyson. And obviously what you're talking about really centers around some of the core values of what good transportation planning has been about all the time. We've always said that one of the goals is to make sure that all forms of transportation interlink with each other. And then when you relate that to communicating, it's the same thing. Our joint authorities should be talking to the others around them. And then finally, as you talk about one universal schedule, if you will, that we can all understand within our area, all of that is interrelated. And so I think that some of these concepts have been before us, but somehow we just did not really open our eyes to see the connectedness of all three of those ideas that you've given us. And then finally, I will say that, again, as has been brought to our attention by many of the presenters before you this morning, that we really do have to fight to make sure that the funding for transportation that really has been provided by the public, that a good majority of that money stays in place for us to move forward with transportation, because truly we believe, those of us, the majority of the committee members, some who had other commitments today, but all of whom have said that they strongly believe that rail transportation will help to improve the quality of life for Californians from all of our regions, from Southern California to the Central Valley area, where there's less economic development than perhaps in both the North and South. But if we had, for example, the realization of high-speed rail, then a Californian could move from San Diego to San Francisco, from the middle of the state to San Francisco or San Diego, thus improving their quality of life, enjoying all that the state that they belong to has to offer. So I thank you for your recommendations here in our conclusion, and we will be in contact with you as we move throughout. Let me say in conclusion that we will also deal with, in our next hearing in Los Angeles, this issue of the transportation control system that Senator Dianne Feinstein has pushed last year as a result of some of the safety problems that we have had. And we will look at some of the unique safety problems that have revealed themselves in the Los Angeles area. So we also will be in contact with you as you have perspectives on rail safety as we move to our next hearing. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We really appreciate your attention to this issue.
Thank you.
It's very important.
Thanks. Thank you. And any final comments, Member Galgiani?
No, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. And again, we look forward to working with you.